It started on a rainy afternoon, the kind that presses quietly against the windows and wraps the house in a hush that feels almost sacred. The kind of rain that doesn't demand attention but simply is, steady and soft like a lullaby. 9-year-old Mara had wandered through every familiar corner of her grandmother's old house, her socks whispering over wooden floors, the scent of dust and lemon soap gently hanging in the air. She wasn't exactly bored, just quietly restless, the way children sometimes are when something unnamed stirs inside them. It was then, in the half-curious and half-lonely pause of the day, that she noticed the pull-down string in the hallway ceiling. It dangled like a secret. Her grandmother had never forbidden the attic, but she had never spoken of it either, as though the space had fallen out of time and simply stopped being a part of the living world below. Mara hesitated only briefly before reaching up, and the creak of the unfolding ladder startled even the walls. The attic welcomed her with a sigh of warm, still air and a single shaft of late afternoon light filtering through a small, round window, dust motes dancing in it like quiet music. The space smelled of paper and fabric, time and memory, and her small feet made soft thuds on the old floorboards as she stepped carefully between forgotten trunks, old books, and boxes labeled in neat, faded handwriting. She found it near the far corner, resting on an antique rocking chair, its fabric faded but inviting, a pillow, square and plump, wrapped in a cover that looked hand-stitched with tiny stars along the edge. There was nothing especially magical about it, at least not in the way that stories usually describe. No sparkle, no hum, no glow. Just, a feeling. As though it had been waiting. Mara reached out and picked it up, surprised by its comforting weight, and in that moment, a whisper of lavender and something sweet, vanilla, perhaps, rose from its threads. She carried it downstairs without much thought, hugging it close as she settled on the couch beside the rain-dappled window, the world outside a blur of silver and green. Her grandmother glanced at her, eyebrows lifting with the hint of a memory. "That old thing," she murmured, half to herself. "I haven't seen it in years. Used to belong to your great-aunt May. She always said it helped her sleep, claimed it told her stories, if you can believe that." Mara smiled but didn't respond. She didn't quite believe it, of course, not in the logical sense, but something in her chest felt warm at the idea. That night, after her warm bath and a dinner of lentil soup and buttered bread, Mara carried the pillow into the guest bedroom and tucked it behind her head. The sheets were cool and soft, and outside the window, the rain had softened to a whisper. Her grandmother had turned off the lights with a kiss on her forehead and a simple, "Sweet dreams, darling." The room was still. And then, as her eyes began to flutter closed, it happened. A voice, not loud, not frightening, rose gently in her mind, as though drifting on the edge of thought and sleep. It was a woman's voice, kind and low, like a bedtime song sung from memory. The voice didn't speak to her exactly, nor was it entirely in her ear. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, warm and honey-slow. Once, in a village where the wind was always kind, there lived a boy who could hear colors. Mara's breath caught slightly, but she stayed still. It didn't feel like a dream, not yet. It felt like the moment before a dream begins, fragile, private, real. The story unfolded gently, slowly, like a painting drawn with words. The boy who heard colors as sounds, green whispering like leaves, red laughing like flutes, blue humming like rivers. He had no name in the story, just the boy, and yet Mara felt like she had always known him. He wandered the hillsides of his village, listening to fields of gold hum lullabies at dusk. He was quiet and kind, not lonely but solitary, and he lived with a grandmother who sewed music into her clothes. The colors changed with his feelings, became louder in the rain, and softened under the stars. The story didn't end with a twist or a lesson, it just gently faded, the boy falling asleep under a lavender sky, the voice quieting until there was only the rhythm of Mara's breathing and the slow drip of rain from the eaves. She opened her eyes just once before sleep took her fully, to be sure. No, the room was empty, her grandmother's house as ordinary and quiet as always. And yet, the pillow beneath her head was warm. Comforting. Alive, somehow. In the soft darkness, Mara's heart beat slowly, peacefully, wrapped in the fading glow of a story she hadn't known she needed. That night, she slept more deeply than she could remember. And in the morning, with the light soft and golden on her blankets, she sat up slowly, the pillow still beneath her, and whispered, "Tell me another." The next night, the sky was clear, the rain gone as though it had never been, leaving behind only the damp scent of earth and pine drifting in through the open window. Mara had spent the day half present, her body going through the gentle motions of a summer visit, helping her grandmother shell peas on the porch, brushing the cat's fur as it purred beneath her hand, rereading old fairy tales on the swing, but her thoughts remained gently tethered to the memory of the pillow and its whispering voice. She hadn't told anyone. Not her grandmother, not even herself, not really. Some things don't need to be named to be real. As the sun folded itself into the horizon and the air cooled into evening, Mara found herself once again brushing her teeth slowly, her thoughts soft and misted with anticipation. The pillow sat quietly on the guest bed as though it had always belonged there, as though it had never spent years alone in the attic's dust and silence. When she laid her head down that night, her body instantly eased, her muscles remembering something older than thought, something like trust. The room was lit only by the silver glow of the moon, resting in a thin pool across the floor. Her grandmother's footsteps had faded, the whole house settling into its nightly breath. And then, as if the pillow had been waiting for the world to go quiet, the voice returned. Just as soft, just as real. There once was a girl who built a paper boat every night before bed and sent it across the quiet sea. Mara's chest rose slowly. The voice was not just telling a story, it was carrying her, gently, across some invisible threshold into a place both new and deeply familiar. The story unfolded like mist on water, and Mara felt herself melt into it. The girl in the tale lived on a cliff above the sea, in a small cottage with shutters painted the color of eggshells and a wind chime that sang to the breeze. Every evening, after brushing her long hair and sipping warm milk, she would take a single piece of paper, sometimes a grocery receipt, sometimes the back of an old letter, and fold it carefully, deliberately, into a boat. She never rushed. There was no need to. She would light a single candle in a lantern, walk down the winding path through the tall grass, and release her tiny creation into the ocean, no matter the weather. Some nights the waves were still as sleep itself, other nights they snarled with distant storms, but always, always, the boat went. Where does it go? Mara found herself wondering, not aloud, but somewhere in that quiet space between thought and dream. And as if the story had heard her, it answered. She never asked it to return, only to carry her wishes far enough that the stars could read them. The voice lingered here, as if letting those words soak into Mara's ribs. She pictured it, the candlelit paper boat drifting farther and farther, a tiny flame among endless blue, like a floating hope no larger than a breath. In the story, the girl's wishes weren't grand. They weren't for riches or fame or even answers. One night she wished for peace in her brother's heart. Another night, she wished that the fox she saw limping by the dunes would find a safe den. Some nights she simply sent a wish of thanks, for her warm bed, her quiet home, the way the moonlight touched her floor like a blessing. The voice spoke with such tenderness, as though it too admired this quiet ritual, this nightly act of release. And just when Mara thought the story might end there, something shifted. One night, The girl in the story awoke to find a folded note beneath her pillow, not written in her own hand, but creased with the same careful folds as her boat's. It read, "We heard you. Thank you." Nothing more. No signature, no explanation. Just that. And from that night on, each paper boat she folded carried not just a wish, but a knowing, that somewhere, someone was listening. Mara felt a shiver, not of fear, but of wonder. The story closed itself gently, like a door clicking softly into its frame. The voice faded again, as though stepping back into the pillow's threads. The room was still. Outside, a single cricket sang. Mara lay motionless for a long while, her breath slowing, her heartbeat low and steady, her limbs warm beneath the covers. She felt full, not the way a meal fills the belly, but the way a song lingers in the chest after the last note. Before her eyes fluttered shut completely, her hand reached out and touched the edge of the pillow, fingertips brushing its stitched stars as if to say, "I heard you too." Sleep came quietly, like a paper boat drifting into the dark, carrying no demands, only a child's silent gratitude. By the third night, Mara no longer questioned the story's arrival. It had become a quiet certainty, like the soft click of a lamp being turned off or the scent of chamomile rising from a cup. It was a new kind of comfort, the kind that seeped into her without asking for permission, one that didn't need to be named out loud to feel real. The sun had long since set, and the silence in her grandmother's home had grown thick and warm, like a quilt stitched from old songs. Mara nestled beneath her blankets, her head gently resting on the now familiar pillow that felt like a secret she was being allowed to keep. She didn't even close her eyes this time, just waited, breathing slowly, letting the night settle around her. And right on cue, the voice returned. It came not like an announcement, but like a hand brushing hair from a sleeping forehead. There once was a boy who collected shadows, not just his own, but others, too. And every time he gave one away, something in the world became a little lighter. Mara felt her body sink into the bed, her attention folding neatly into the tale, the way a leaf drifts into still water. The boy lived in a town that forgot to look at the sky. People hurried, people sighed. They frowned into the glow of screens, passed one another with heads bent low, and spoke in tired voices that rarely meant what they said. But the boy, he saw things. He noticed how long a shadow stretched when someone felt lonely, how it curled tightly when someone was afraid, how it scattered in little pieces when a heart was quietly breaking. He carried a small satchel sewn from a dove-gray cloth, and in it, he tucked shadows. Not by stealing them, never that, but by asking. With a look. With a silence. With the stillness of someone who listens not just to words but to the space between them. "Would you like me to hold that for you?" his eyes would seem to say. And the shadows, tired, frayed, heavy from being dragged behind tired bodies all day, they'd slip from their owners and nestle into the satchel without a sound. One at a time. Gently. He never kept them for long. That wasn't the point. The boy had found a place, an old greenhouse behind the library, long abandoned and overgrown with ivy and sleeping moss. No one ever went there, not even the gardeners. But he did. He would place the collected shadows beneath sunbeams that streamed through the dusty glass panes. Something about the light there was different, softer, kinder. And when the sun touched the shadows, they changed. Some turned into butterflies and disappeared into the sky. Some melted into puddles and watered the thirsty plants. Some turned into stories that floated into the town like distant songs, carried by the wind. Mara imagined this boy, perhaps not much older than herself, sitting cross-legged in the center of the greenhouse, surrounded by little whirls of darkness slowly blooming into color. He never told anyone his name. He didn't need to. The people in the town didn't quite remember him, but they remembered how their feet felt lighter when they walked home. They remembered suddenly looking up one evening and noticing the shape of the clouds. They remembered dreaming again. And though no one said it out loud, they began to carry their shadows a little differently, not as burdens, but as something they might one day be ready to let go. The story quieted here, the voice slowing into something just above silence. Mara felt her eyes fluttering, the edges of her consciousness softening like fabric in warm water. But just before the voice disappeared entirely, it offered one last image, an old woman in the town, sitting on a park bench, with a shadow shaped like sorrow beside her. The boy passed by and met her eyes. She nodded, just once. And when he walked away, her shadow did not follow her. It stayed on the bench for a long while, then turned its face toward the sunlight and vanished. The voice didn't explain who the boy was, or where he went, or why the greenhouse always knew what to do with the dark things people couldn't carry anymore. But it didn't have to. Some stories don't ask to be understood. They only ask to be felt. And Mara felt this one settle deep into her bones, not as something to analyze or even retell, but as something to carry gently, the way the boy carried shadows, until it, too, was ready to become something else. As her breath deepened and her body went still, the pillow cradled her head like a hand that promised to never let her fall too far. And in the final moment before sleep, Mara whispered, not with her voice, but with her heart, "I think I have shadows, too." The pillow didn't answer, not with words. But she felt it warm beneath her cheek, soft and sure. And that night, in her dreams, she stood inside a greenhouse bathed in golden light, watching hundreds of shadows turn into wildflowers. By the time the fourth night arrived, Mara no longer wondered if the story would come. It was like knowing the tide would reach the shore, it simply would, without question, without fanfare. That evening, the air outside was thick with the scent of honeysuckle, and fireflies had begun their slow dance across the garden like bits of starlight drifting through the dusk. Mara had watched them for a while from her window, chin resting on the sill, the faint creak of crickets rising like a lullaby from the earth. There was a peace in the house that only seemed to exist after the dishes were done, the lights were low, and her grandmother's humming, soft and wordless, had faded down the hallway. She slipped into bed with the now familiar sense of stepping not just into blankets but into something older, something almost sacred. Her hand brushed the edge of the pillow. It no longer felt like a found object, it felt like a companion. As her breathing slowed, as the room dimmed into stillness, the story began. The voice, as always, was soft, never startling, never urgent. There was once a girl who gathered forgotten names, not from books, not from graves, but from the quiet places where no one remembered to look. And just like that, Mara's mind began to drift along the edge of the story, like a leaf following the pull of a slow river. The girl lived on the edge of a sleeping town where the trees leaned in as if listening to every thought. She wore a satchel made of faded velvet and walked barefoot through meadows and alleyways, riversides and rooftops, always listening, always watching for the faint shimmer that marked where a name had once lived but been left behind. These weren't just any names. They weren't names you could find in baby books or office ledgers. These were names whispered by someone once and then never again, names of lost pets, of imagined friends, of dreams people had tucked away too tightly to remember. The girl found them in puddles, in the rustling of old leaves, in the backs of closets where forgotten toys waited silently. Each name glowed faintly when she touched it, like an ember not yet gone cold. She would hold it in her hand, whisper it once, and tuck it gently into her satchel where it would rest until it was needed again. Mara pictured her clearly, thin and quiet, with kind eyes and windswept hair, like someone who lived in the pages between a poem and a sigh. The girl didn't collect the names to keep them. She wasn't hoarding magic or seeking power. She believed, simply, that no name should be unloved. That every name, no matter how briefly spoken, deserved to be remembered. Sometimes, when a person in town seemed heavy with a sadness they couldn't name, the girl would gently return a name to them. Not out loud, not in a dramatic flash, but in a breeze that whispered it just softly enough to stir something. A man who had stopped painting would hear the name of his childhood dog in the rustling branches, and suddenly feel color move through him again. A woman who had lost her joy would hear a name she once gave to the moon and suddenly look up again at the stars. The names didn't fix everything. But they opened tiny doors. And through those doors, light sometimes crept in. The story took its time, unfolding not in events but in feelings, in moments so small they might have been missed by anyone not listening closely. Mara listened. Her heart listened. The voice never hurried. One day, it said, the girl came upon a name unlike any she had found before. It sat at the center of an old swing set in a forgotten park, tangled in the rust of the chains, hidden in the shadow of a tree that no longer bloomed. The name pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat too long ignored. When she picked it up, the girl felt something she never had before, a weight, a history, a kind of yearning that made her chest ache. It wasn't just a name. It was a whole piece of someone. And yet, she couldn't tell whose it had been. Not a child, not an animal, not a dream. Just, a presence. She carried it longer than any other, tucked it beneath her pillow each night, and whispered it to the wind each morning. Slowly, the name began to glow more brightly, like it was waking up. And one morning, she woke to find a small, delicate flower growing beside her bed. A name becoming a life again. Mara felt something stir deep in her chest as the voice softened further, fading like light slipping beneath the horizon. She didn't always know what became of the names she gave back, the voice murmured. But she trusted that even the forgotten things still mattered. Maybe especially those. The voice was gone now, but its warmth lingered in the space around Mara, in the hush between her breath and the rise of the moonlight through her window. Her limbs were heavy with comfort, and her thoughts swam slowly like fish in a quiet stream. She turned gently on her side, the pillow fitting perfectly beneath her cheek. And before her thoughts vanished entirely into sleep, she wondered, not with urgency, but with the quiet curiosity of a soul that had begun to listen more closely, what names have I forgotten? And who might be holding them for me? The night offered no answer. But the pillow beneath her felt just a little warmer, and the stars outside the window glowed like they, too, were remembering something. By the fifth night, the boundary between Mara's waking world and the realm of stories had grown thinner, softer, as though the line between real and imagined wasn't a line at all, but a gentle fog that she could step through with a single breath. There was no longer a pause, no moment of doubt, when she laid her head on the pillow, only the steady rhythm of trust. Outside her window, the trees swayed in slow conversation with the wind, their leaves rustling in long, drawn-out whispers. Her grandmother's home, full of the gentle sighs of old wood and settled dreams, seemed to lean into the stillness with her. As her eyes drifted closed and her body melted into the bed's familiar embrace, the voice returned, not as a surprise, but as a welcome companion. There once was a mapmaker who could not draw what he saw, only what he felt, and so every map he made was made of wind. The words settled gently around Mara, and she let herself drift into their current like a boat loosening from the shore. The mapmaker lived on the highest hill overlooking a wide, endless valley. His cottage was small and quiet, with parchment curled on every shelf and ink jars sealed with wax to keep the breeze from drinking them dry. He was a quiet man, gentle in his movements, always barefoot. His maps were never precise, no neat lines, no landmarks, no scales or legends. Instead, he charted how the world moved. His fingers traced the way morning light rolled down the side of a mountain, how sorrow gathered in hollows of earth after a long rain, how joy rose like heat from a sun-warmed stone. His maps had no labels, no borders. Only curves and shapes, soft patterns that looked more like dreams than geography. And still, travelers came. Not the kind who needed directions, but the kind who had lost something, something they couldn't name. A woman whose voice had grown quiet after a long year of being unheard. A child who no longer dreamed of flying. A man whose laughter had folded in on itself and disappeared. Each came with a question they didn't quite know how to ask. The mapmaker never asked for details. He simply invited them to sit, offered them tea steeped with thyme and mint, and watched them with eyes that saw not their faces, but the winds moving through their hearts. Then he would reach for a sheet of thick, soft paper, dip his brush into water, then ink, and begin. He never rushed. He never spoke while he worked. His hand moved like the breeze through grass, gently and with a kind of knowing. When he was finished, he would hand the map over, rolled and tied with twine, and say only, "This will show you not where to go, but where you are." Mara felt a stillness settle deep inside her as the voice continued, slow and steady. One day, the mapmaker received a visitor unlike any other, a boy who said nothing at all. He stood in the doorway for a long time before entering, and when he finally sat down, the mapmaker noticed his eyes were not filled with sorrow or confusion, but emptiness. Like someone who had forgotten what it meant to feel at all. The boy didn't drink the tea. He didn't ask for a map. He only sat, quietly, as the wind moved softly through the open windows. And then, just as the mapmaker began to wonder whether this time would be different, the boy reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was one of the mapmaker's own. One he had made long ago, and sent out into the world. But this map had changed. There were markings on it that he hadn't made. Faint scratches, delicate folds, places where someone had touched it with trembling hands. "I followed this," the boy said, his voice barely audible, "but I still don't know who I am." The mapmaker took the paper gently, smoothing it between his palms. He studied it, not just the lines, but the places where it had been held, the smudges made by rain or tears or dirt. Then he set it aside and pulled out a blank page. But this time, instead of ink, he dipped his brush in the wind itself, just the idea of it, the memory of it, and began painting not a path, but a pulse. The boy watched in silence as the lines took shape. When it was done, the mapmaker didn't roll it. He handed it to the boy flat, letting the page catch the breeze. "This one isn't for traveling," he said. "This one is for remembering." The boy took it carefully, and as he looked at it, Mara imagined his chest lifting just a little, as though something within him had finally exhaled. "Maps don't always point the way forward," the mapmaker added softly. "Sometimes they bring you back to the place inside yourself you thought you'd lost." The voice faded then, like the tail end of a breath, leaving only stillness in the room and the quiet murmur of wind against the glass. Mara lay still for a long time, her breath slow and even, her thoughts full of curves and lines that weren't roads, but feelings. She thought of all the places she had been, not just with her feet, but with her heart. The way missing her parents sometimes made her feel like a hallway without doors. The way holding her grandmother's hand could make even a cold morning feel like sunlight. Maybe we all needed maps, she thought, but not the kind you fold up or read aloud. The kind that remind us we are still here. Still moving. Still whole. Her eyes closed completely now, and the pillow beneath her head felt softer than ever, as if it, too, had mapped every inch of her dreams. And just before sleep took her, Mara whispered, "I wonder what my wind map would look like." And somewhere, far away, or maybe very close, a brush dipped into air began to paint. The sixth night arrived like a page turning itself. Mara had spent much of the day in quiet observation, her senses more attuned now, her thoughts moving more slowly, more deeply, like water running beneath ice. She noticed the way the floorboards in her grandmother's hallway creaked in different tones depending on where she stepped. She noticed the way the sun slipped through the leaves outside the kitchen window in long, trembling strips of gold. She noticed herself, too, how she was changing. Not in any dramatic way, not outwardly. But there was a softness blooming in her thoughts now, a kind of listening that hadn't been there before. She didn't rush to bed, but she didn't delay either. When the time came, she climbed beneath the covers with a feeling of quiet readiness, as though she had been walking toward this moment all day. Her fingers brushed the pillow with the same familiarity one might offer a friend's hand. No sooner had her breath begun to slow than the story unfolded around her like fog over still water. The voice was waiting, as always, kind and steady. There once was a clockmaker who lived in a town where time no longer quite worked the way it should. Minutes spilled, hours curled in on themselves, and no one could remember the last time they truly felt present. Mara's body stilled completely, her thoughts leaning into the voice like petals toward sunlight. The clockmaker lived alone above a tiny shop at the end of a forgotten street, where vines crawled up the window frames and bells chimed at the wrong hours. He was an old man with gentle hands and a faraway look in his eyes, as if he were always listening to something other people couldn't hear. His workshop was filled with clocks, grandfather clocks, pocket watches, delicate carriage timepieces, all ticking softly, but none of them keeping the same time. Some ran fast, others slow. Some paused for hours before resuming as if nothing had happened. No one in the town minded much anymore. People had long since stopped wearing watches. They had stopped arriving on time, or expecting others to. Everything was late. Or early. Or, unmeasured. But the clockmaker kept working. Not because he wanted to fix time, but because he wanted to understand it. Mara imagined him hunched over a workbench, glasses perched on the tip of his nose, turning tiny gears between his fingers like puzzle pieces made of memory. What made a moment linger? What made one afternoon stretch and another vanish? Why did some seconds ache and others hum with joy? He never asked the townspeople these things. But he watched them. He noticed how the widow who lived across the lane seemed to walk more slowly on days the sun hung low. He saw how the boy who delivered bread paused a little longer by the church fountain when the wind played with his curls. The clockmaker began collecting not hours, but moments. He wrote them down in a leather-bound book, pages filled not with numbers, but with sentences. The moment the sky turned the color of peaches. The moment a child's laugh echoed twice against the stone wall. The moment a heart began to heal, though no one knew it yet. He filled the book over many years, line by line. And one evening, as the last light dipped below the rooftops, he did something no one expected, he built a clock unlike any other. It had no hands. No numbers. Just a single, slowly turning ring of glass. And within it, the most delicate sound, like a breath. Like a heartbeat resting. When people entered the shop, the clock responded. It didn't chime. It didn't tick. It felt. A woman who had rushed her whole life stood before it and began to cry, though she didn't know why. A man who never spoke above a whisper found his voice lifting into song as he stood near the quiet hum of the wheel. The clock didn't tell them the time. It told them their time. When to pause. When to listen. When to let go. The clockmaker, the voice said gently, had discovered the 1 hour that didn't exist on any other clock. He called it the quiet hour. It wasn't always the same 60 minutes. Sometimes it was 5. Sometimes it was 2. Sometimes it stretched through a whole evening. It came only when a person allowed it. It asked for nothing. Demanded nothing. It simply invited stillness. That was all. And, as Mara listened, she realized something had changed in her room, too. Her own quiet hour had arrived. She felt it in her chest, in her breath, in the way her fingers had gone loose against the edge of the blanket. No thoughts hurried. No memories tugged. Only stillness. Only this. The story didn't end with any great moment. The clockmaker didn't die, or disappear, or become famous. He simply kept making small repairs. Not to clocks, but to time itself, as it passed through the people who came to his door. The voice faded, and Mara let it go, her mind as still and open as the turning glass ring in the clockmaker's shop. Outside, the wind had quieted. Even the trees seemed to be holding their breath. She smiled, barely, feeling it stretch from somewhere deep inside her. And just before her eyes closed, she thought, tonight, I found the quiet hour. And it found me. The pillow beneath her head held her gently, not like an object, but like a pause, a beautiful one, and the world grew silent around her, not empty, but full of peace. By the 7th night, something had shifted, not in the house, not in the air, but inside Mara. She moved through the day as though wrapped in soft music only she could hear. Even her grandmother noticed it, tilting her head slightly when Mara lingered longer at the window or stared quietly at the rain curling down the glass, as if seeing the world for the first time, or perhaps remembering it. That evening, after brushing her teeth in the soft hum of crickets and pulling her sweater a little tighter around her shoulders, Mara climbed into bed with a slow, familiar grace. She didn't need to hope for the story anymore. She simply made space for it, the way you would for a friend who always arrives right on time, even when no clock says so. She lay her head gently on the pillow, the fabric cool at first and then warm, like a living thing. The house exhaled. And then, like the first note of a lullaby, the voice returned. There once was a library that held only unread books, stories no one had ever finished, or even begun. Mara's breath caught, but not from surprise. The stories always began this way now, with wonder, not noise. She saw the library clearly before the voice even continued, tall stone walls tucked between two forgotten streets, ivy curling around the corners like curious fingers, windows fogged with mystery. No one remembered who had built it. It wasn't on any maps, and it didn't open at set hours. People didn't find it because they were looking for it, they found it because they were ready for it. Inside, it smelled of dust and ink, old dreams and fresh paper. The shelves towered higher than any ladder could reach, lined with books bound in leather, linen, bark, and silk. None of the titles were visible. The spines bore no letters, no numbers. Only soft symbols, moons, feathers, rain. Sometimes, if you brushed your fingers along a shelf without thinking too hard, a book would hum softly under your touch. The unread ones. The waiting ones. And the librarian, Mara could see her now, was not a woman of grand gestures or long speeches. She was quiet, elegant in the way shadows are at dusk. She wore robes the color of moth wings and glasses shaped like crescent moons. Her voice, if you ever heard it, was softer than thought. She didn't tell you what to read. She simply looked at you, nodded once, and pointed. That was enough. The books in this library, the voice continued gently, did not contain what had been written, but what might still be. Each one was a possibility, a story abandoned halfway through, or never started at all. Some had been left behind because someone lost courage. Others were forgotten in the rush of the world. And some had never been opened because the person they belonged to hadn't yet become who they needed to be to read them. The pages were not empty, but waiting, thin as breath, and full of silence that pulsed like potential. Visitors came in all ages and shapes, a girl with paint on her fingertips, a man who carried a broken violin, a woman who had stopped dreaming after she turned 40. None of them spoke when they entered. They simply wandered, slowly, as if the walls themselves were guiding them. Mara imagined walking through those rows herself, fingertips grazing soft spines, pausing in front of books that almost called her name. And then, the voice described a boy, not unlike herself, not quite older, not quite younger, who wandered in one rainy morning, his coat dripping at the doorway. He had never written a word in his life. But he had thought of stories. Hundreds. Tiny ones. He had imagined talking forests and rivers that whispered back. He had seen dreams in the steam rising from his tea. But he had never begun. Because he believed stories came only from those who knew how they ended. The librarian said nothing. Just handed him a book bound in pale blue cloth, a silver thread tied around the middle. He opened it. Slowly. Inside, there were only 2 sentences. The first, "This is where you begin." The second, further down the page, "You will not know the ending until you live it." And that was it. The rest of the pages shimmered faintly, not blank, not full, just open. The boy closed the book, held it to his chest, and walked out, into the mist. And the library, as it always did, kept waiting. For more books to be found. For more people to become ready. The voice slowed now, softer, like the dimming of a lamp. Sometimes, it said, the stories we need most are the ones we haven't told yet. Not to others. Not even to ourselves. Mara felt the truth of that settle into her like a quiet heartbeat. She wondered if somewhere, in that impossible library, there was a book waiting for her. One that carried all the stories she hadn't yet dared to speak. Not because she was afraid, but because she hadn't known they belonged to her. Not until now. She didn't need to know the ending. She only needed to begin. As the voice faded and the room returned to its stillness, Mara turned slightly, the pillow nestling deeper beneath her cheek. Her breathing was slow. Her limbs, soft with sleep. And before she drifted away entirely, she whispered, not aloud, but inside herself, "I think I'm ready for my own book." The pillow, ever silent, ever listening, held her answer in warmth alone. And the night, vast and starlit, turned one page more. By the 8th night, Mara no longer felt like a listener of the stories, but a part of them, threaded through their quiet spaces, held in their silences. The pillow had become her portal, her confidant, her compass. Each evening, when the house sighed into stillness and the light softened to indigo, Mara climbed into bed not to sleep, but to return to that inner world made of whispers and wonder, where time didn't tick but flowed, and where every story felt like it had been gently placed inside her heart long ago, just waiting to be remembered. That night, the air was cool with a coming storm, the sky veiled in low-hanging clouds, and the hush in the room felt heavier, more thoughtful. When the voice arrived, it didn't greet her with brightness, but with gravity, like a hand placed over hers. There was once a bridge that waited, not to be crossed, not to be built, but to be understood. The image came softly at first, a narrow bridge suspended across a quiet ravine, weathered wood grayed by time, ropes creaking gently in the wind. It wasn't a grand bridge. It didn't connect cities or kingdoms or trade routes. It existed in a place most people never reached, not because it was far, but because it was inward. The villagers nearby called it the Bridge of Between. No one could quite say when it was built or by whom. Some said it had always been there. Others said it appeared only when someone needed it. But all agreed on one thing: the bridge could not be crossed until you were ready, and being ready had nothing to do with strength or knowledge. It had everything to do with honesty. The kind that lives deep inside your chest, quiet and often uncomfortable. Mara imagined standing before it, The board stretched out across the drop below, narrow and uncertain. On the other side, mist. Nothing visible. Nothing promised. People came to the bridge with questions. Am I ready to leave the past behind? Am I still who I thought I was? What if I never become who I hope to be? The bridge answered with silence. But it waited. Always waited. Then the voice told her about a girl, older than Mara, but not by much, who arrived barefoot, carrying a backpack full of journals. Not because they were useful, but because she couldn't bear to leave them behind. The bridge creaked softly under her steps as she approached, and as she placed one foot on the first plank, it pulsed beneath her. Not a rejection. A question. She sat down instead of walking forward. She opened one of the journals and began to read. And what she found there weren't memories, but expectations, things others had told her she had to be. She flipped through page after page of versions of herself that no longer felt true. One by one, she tore them out, gently, like parting from a version of yourself you once loved, but no longer needed. She set them down beside her, each page catching the wind and lifting into the sky like birds set free. Only when her bag was empty did she rise. The bridge stilled. The ropes stopped swaying. And the mist on the other side began to glow. The bridge, the voice murmured, doesn't carry you forward. It asks you to release what you cannot take with you. Mara felt her throat tighten. She thought of the things she carried, not in her hands, but in her heart. The small guilts. The questions about where she belonged now. The ache of her parents being far, the way she sometimes wondered if she was still the same girl she had been before the world changed. Maybe, she thought, that's why she had found this pillow. Maybe the stories had been helping her unpack what she'd never known how to set down. The voice continued, telling her of a man who arrived at the bridge after years of pretending he didn't need anyone. He stood at the edge for 3 nights, the bridge unmoving. On the 4th, he whispered his father's name into the wind, and the bridge rippled with light. It wasn't about solving things. It was about acknowledging what had been buried. One name. That was all it took to soften the weight. The man walked forward. The bridge allowed it. The voice began to dim now, folding the story into silence. You don't cross the bridge of between with your feet, it whispered. You cross it with your heart. Mara lay still, her fingers resting gently against the edge of the pillow. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the windows like a lullaby spun in a darker key. She didn't need to see the bridge to know it was real. She could feel it now, suspended inside her. She understood, it was never about where you were going. It was about what you were willing to let go of so you could arrive fully, wherever that was. Her body grew heavier in the bed, her mind loosening its grip on the day. And just before she fell into sleep, Mara felt it, not in words, but in sensation. The bridge had appeared for her, too. Not to cross just yet. But to recognize. And in her dreams that night, she stood at its edge with empty hands, breathing in the scent of old wood, ready to begin. By the 9th night, Mara didn't just listen to the stories, she carried them. During the day, when sunlight fell through the trees and scattered itself across the porch, she'd find herself tracing patterns in the grain of the wood, wondering if a name was hidden there. At lunch, she caught herself staring at the steam rising from her soup, wondering if it was drawing maps like the wind once did. The world around her hadn't changed, but the way she moved through it had. Everything now seemed to whisper, look again. So when the house dimmed into its evening hush and her grandmother's soft footsteps retreated down the hallway, Mara slipped into bed with the kind of reverence that most children saved for fairy lights or fireflies. The pillow welcomed her as always, holding the quiet like a secret, and the voice returned without hesitation, as if it had been speaking to her even while she was awake. There once was a boy who spoke to shadows, not because he was lonely, but because they were the only ones who told him the truth. Mara's breath slowed. She could already feel this story was different, not darker, but deeper, like a hand reaching gently beneath the surface of still water. The boy lived in a small village built into the side of a mountain, where the sun rose late and set early, and the people had grown used to living in the brief hours between. They believed in light and feared the dark, not in the way children fear monsters under the bed, but in a quiet, persistent way, as if the night itself might listen to your secrets and use them against you. And so, everyone in the village learned to silence their doubts before sunset. To smile even when their hearts were heavy. To speak only of things that shone. The boy was different. He had always noticed the shadows, not just the ones on walls or beneath trees, but the ones people carried inside them. He saw how his mother's laughter never quite reached her eyes. He saw how the village elder's shoulders curled inward with a weight no one dared to name. And when he lay in bed at night, he didn't close his eyes to escape the dark, he opened them wider. That was when the shadows spoke. Not with voices, but with shapes. With quiet flickers. They danced along his walls and ceiling, sometimes trembling, sometimes bold. At first, he thought he was imagining it. But then they began to respond, shifting when he asked questions, curling when he cried, stretching across his room when he felt brave enough to ask, "What are you really trying to say?" The shadows never lied. They never softened the truth. But they were never cruel. They told him things that the people around him didn't know how to say, that sometimes love can leave a bruise, even when it means well. That sometimes joy is real and sorrow lives inside it. That pretending to be fine is a quiet kind of loneliness. The boy began to keep a journal, not of what people said, but of what their shadows whispered when they thought no one was listening. He didn't use names. He didn't judge. He just listened, and wrote, and listened again. Then, one evening, something strange happened. As the village gathered for their yearly festival of light, a celebration meant to push the darkness away, the boy noticed the shadows beginning to change. They grew longer, yes, but also, quieter. Sadder. As though they were being forced into corners, unwanted. He walked among the glowing lanterns and smiling faces, and all he could feel was the weight of everything left unspoken. And then, without warning, a gust of wind tore through the square, knocking over candles and rattling the paper lanterns. People gasped. Darkness spilled suddenly across the festival like ink across a table. And in that moment, the boy stepped forward, not to restore the light, but to speak into the dark. "It's okay," he whispered, arms open to the night. "You're safe here." And the shadows, stilled. They didn't flee. They didn't lash out. They gathered, gently, around him. Not to smother, but to rest. To be seen. The villagers, stunned into stillness, watched as the boy knelt in the heart of the darkness with a calm that radiated outward. No fear. No shame. Just a soft invitation to be whole again. The shadows began to lift, not disappear, not vanish, but settle back into balance, like a deep breath after a long silence. And the light returned, not brighter, but truer. From that night on, the voice said softly, the boy became the keeper of what was hidden, the one people visited when their insides grew too heavy. He never offered advice. Only space. Only presence. Only the truth shadows tell when someone dares to ask. Mara's eyes fluttered, barely open, the corners of her mouth turning into the faintest smile. She understood. The story wasn't about darkness, not really. It was about seeing, all of it. The joy and the ache, the love and the questions, the parts of herself she sometimes tried to keep small. Maybe the shadows weren't there to scare her. Maybe they were there to help her find what she hadn't yet dared to hold. The voice faded gently, like fog dissolving into morning air. And Mara, with her hand resting on the pillow's edge, let her breath slow into sleep. In her dreams that night, shadows danced softly along her bedroom walls, but this time, they didn't whisper secrets. They just stayed. Quiet. Honest. And whole. On the 10th night, the air in Mara's room felt tender, like the quiet pause between heartbeats, and as she settled into bed, the pillow beneath her head seemed to breathe with a softness that matched the stillness growing inside her. The stories had become a part of her night's rhythm, each one weaving into the next, a tapestry of gentle truths and subtle wonders. Tonight, the voice came slower, more like a sigh than a story, inviting Mara to step into a world both familiar and strange, a garden where wishes once planted grew quietly, but had since been forgotten. This was no ordinary garden, the voice explained. It was tucked behind an old stone wall, hidden beneath wildflowers and moss, and tended by hands that moved with care even though no one had visited for many years. The garden was alive with soft colors that didn't shout, but whispered, a kind of silence full of waiting. The flowers were not roses or lilies, but delicate blooms shaped like little hearts, shimmering with the light of dreams made long ago. Each bloom held a wish, fragile and pure, pressed into its petals like a secret kept safe. The gardeners who once tended this place were not gardeners in the usual sense. They were dream keepers, people who collected wishes when no one was watching, planting them carefully beneath the earth, hoping they would grow into something beautiful someday. But as the years passed, the world outside grew louder, faster, busier, and people forgot the garden. They forgot the wishes they once made under the stars, whispered into the night. They forgot how to listen for the quiet, hopeful voice inside their own hearts. The garden began to wilt, not from neglect, but from being unseen. Then, one day, a girl wandered into the garden, not by chance, but because something inside her had remembered the way back. She was small, with hands that trembled like leaves in a breeze, and eyes that held both curiosity and sorrow. She knelt among the fading blooms and began to whisper to them, not with words, but with feeling. She touched each flower gently, her fingers brushing petals like a lullaby. The wishes stirred. Some shimmered faintly. Some bloomed anew. The girl did not pick the flowers. She did not take the wishes away. She simply sat with them, honoring their presence. And in that quiet act, the garden breathed again. It was not a loud rebirth, but a slow, steady waking, like dawn brushing light across the horizon. The voice told Mara that the garden's magic was not in granting wishes, but in remembering them. It reminded those who found it that hopes, no matter how fragile, carry power, power to heal, to change, to open doors inside ourselves we never knew existed. Mara felt a warmth rise inside her chest, soft and steady, as if a small seed had been planted there, waiting to grow. She thought of her own quiet wishes, the ones she had tucked away because they seemed too delicate to speak aloud. The pillow beneath her seemed to hum with understanding, its fabric cool and kind against her cheek. The voice softened, folding the story into silence, saying only this: sometimes, the wishes we forget are the ones that matter most. As Mara's breath deepened and her eyes closed, the garden blossomed all around her, in dreams, in the quiet spaces between waking and sleep, and in the steady beating of her heart. And the night, as always, held her gently, wrapped in the tender peace of forgotten wishes made new again. On the 11th night, the world outside Mara's window seemed to slow, the usual hum of the neighborhood softened into something more like a distant song, barely heard but deeply felt. Mara climbed into bed with a quiet eagerness that surprised her, her fingers brushing the pillow as if it were an old friend. The pillow, cool and familiar, welcomed her like a secret waiting to be told. The voice, gentle and steady as always, began its story, not with a rush, but with a slow, deliberate calm that felt like the ticking of a heart. There was once a clock that lost time, not because it broke, but because it chose to stop. Mara imagined the clock sitting on an ancient mantelpiece, its hands frozen at an unknown hour, its face smooth and calm, untouched by dust or decay. The clock wasn't made of gold or silver. It was simple, wooden, with a soft tick that had once counted the days, the moments, the fleeting seconds. But one day, it stopped. The villagers who lived nearby were puzzled. Some tried to fix it, oil its gears, wind its spring. But nothing worked. Time, it seemed, had slipped away from that clock and found somewhere else to live. But instead of panic or frustration, the clock found peace. It was no longer bound by the urgency of seconds or minutes. It became a quiet witness to the world around it, watching as seasons changed, as children grew older, as leaves turned gold and fell. People began to visit the clock, not to set appointments or mark deadlines, but to rest. To sit and breathe in the stillness that the clock held. In that stillness, they found something unexpected: space. Space to pause. Space to listen to their own hearts without the pressure of rushing forward. Mara thought about the moments in her own life when time had felt like a heavy weight, pressing her to hurry, to finish, to arrive, to be more. The story reminded her that sometimes the most important thing is to stop. To be still. To lose time on purpose so that life could be seen without the blur of hurry. The voice continued, telling her about a woman who came to the clock after years of chasing schedules and deadlines. She sat before it and closed her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she didn't check her watch or phone. She just breathed. The silence wrapped around her like a soft blanket. And slowly, the clock's frozen hands began to move again, not in the sharp ticks of urgency, but in a gentle, steady rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. The villagers called it the clock of quiet time, a reminder that not all moments need to be filled, and not all hours must be measured. Mara felt the story settle inside her like a warm glow. She realized that the pillow was not just telling her stories from faraway places or imagined worlds, it was reminding her of things she already knew, buried beneath the noise of her days. As the voice faded into silence, Mara's eyelids grew heavy. Her breath deepened and slowed. Outside, the world continued its gentle song, but inside her room, time felt suspended, peaceful, whole. And as she drifted toward sleep, the clock's soft rhythm echoed in her chest, a lullaby of stillness, patience, and the quiet power of simply being. On the 12th and final night, Mara lay beneath the soft glow of the moonlight spilling through her window, the pillow beneath her head cool and comforting, cradling her like a long-lost friend. The stories had become more than just tales, they were threads weaving her quietly into something new, something whole. The voice came, softer than ever, carrying a warmth that settled deep inside her chest. There once was a light that lost its way, not because it was dim, but because it had forgotten where it belonged. Mara pictured a small lantern, nestled on a windowsill in a tiny cottage far from bustling cities, its flame flickering uncertainly against the night. The light had traveled far from the place it was meant to shine, through forests thick with silence and across rivers whispering forgotten songs. It wandered alone, unsure if it was still needed, or if it had grown too small to matter. One evening, a child found the lantern lying beneath an ancient oak tree, its glow faint but steady. The child did not rush or panic. Instead, they held the lantern gently, whispering softly, "You are home." And just like that, the light remembered itself. It did not blaze or roar. It simply breathed, steady and sure. It found its place, not because the world demanded it, but because it was loved, and because it was seen. The voice told Mara that the light teaches us that sometimes, the way back is not a path you find, but a feeling you carry. It is not about brilliance or being seen by everyone, but about the quiet knowing that you are enough, that your light, however small, holds the power to make darkness softer, gentler, less alone. Mara felt tears rise softly, not from sadness but from the deep, tender recognition that she too had carried a light that sometimes flickered and faltered, unsure of where it fit. But here, with the pillow, with the stories, she felt that light growing steady again. The voice wrapped the story in a soft silence, a lullaby without words, inviting Mara to rest. She breathed in the stillness, feeling the pulse of the light inside her, steady and warm. As sleep gently took her, she dreamed of that lantern glowing softly on a windowsill, a beacon not just for the world outside, but for the quiet places inside every heart. And when morning came, with the light spilling over her room in soft gold, Mara woke knowing that she carried the stories with her, not just to remember, but to live. The pillow lay still beside her, ordinary and extraordinary all at once, a keeper of stories, a holder of hope, a gentle reminder that sometimes, the greatest journeys happen not across miles or worlds, but within. And so, with a heart full of quiet courage and a light that would never quite go out, Mara stepped into the day, ready to listen, to feel, and to be wholly, beautifully herself. Thanks for journeying with Mara and her pillow. Feel free to share this story with a friend who could use some gentle magic tonight.